The black woman walked through the jet bridge with a quiet confidence that came naturally to her after years of traveling for work. The hum of the airplane's engines vibrated through the floor beneath her steps, mixing with the muffled chatter of passengers still finding their places. She held her boarding pass in her hand, a business-class ticket she had booked weeks in advance. It was an early morning flight, the kind she usually preferred because the cabins were calmer, the crew was more attentive, and the overall atmosphere tended to feel more efficient. She adjusted the strap of her navy blue carry-on bag on her shoulder and continued forward, her posture relaxed but purposeful. As she stepped inside the aircraft, she gave a polite nod to the flight attendant standing near the door. The attendant, a young woman with a clipped smile and tired eyes, barely acknowledged her. It wasn't unusual, she had seen her fair share of flight crews overwhelmed during boarding. She brushed it off and continued onward, heading toward the front section of the cabin. She knew exactly where her seat was, 4A, a window seat with extra legroom, a wider recline, and the kind of quiet that made it easy to prepare for upcoming meetings. Rows of plush, charcoal-colored business-class seats came into view, each separated by a sleek armrest and illuminated by soft amber lighting. The passengers already seated were sipping water, scrolling through phones, or settling in with blankets. She smiled slightly to herself, relieved to finally relax before takeoff. But just as she reached her seat and reached out to store her bag in the overhead bin, she heard a sharp voice behind her. "Ma'am." "Excuse me, ma'am." She turned around slowly, expecting perhaps a simple instruction or a request to pass her bag for inspection. Instead, she was met with the stern expression of the same flight attendant who had barely acknowledged her earlier. The woman's arms were crossed, her brows pulled taut in a way that suggested annoyance rather than concern. "Yes," the passenger said calmly. The flight attendant let out a brief exhale, the kind meant to signal impatience. "You'll need to move to economy, please. This cabin is oversold, and we need to reassign your seat." For a moment, the passenger thought she had misheard. Passengers were rarely, if ever, downgraded without substantial reason, and certainly not passengers with confirmed business-class tickets. "I'm sorry," she replied evenly, "but I have a business-class ticket." "Seat 4A. The attendant nodded sharply. "Yes, I see that. But unfortunately, we're dealing with an overbooking issue. You've been moved to economy. Please gather your belongings and follow me." The passenger blinked, maintaining her composure, though a ripple of confusion and irritation flickered beneath her calm surface. "There must be a mistake," she said, holding up her boarding pass so the flight attendant could see it clearly. "I paid for this seat, and it was confirmed in the app just an hour ago." The attendant didn't even glance at the pass. Instead, she rolled her eyes in a small, dismissive motion. "Ma'am, I'm telling you what the situation is. We need you to move. Other passengers are waiting to sit here." The woman looked around. The cabin was nearly full, but no one seemed to be waiting to sit in her specific area. A few nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly aware of the tension forming. One elderly couple exchanged glances. A man diagonally across the aisle subtly lowered his newspaper to eavesdrop. The air seemed to thicken with an unspoken question, "Why her?" The passenger took a slow breath. She was no stranger to uncomfortable travel situations, but the direct dismissal of her paid ticket, and the tone, were already raising warning flags in her mind. "I'm happy to discuss this," she said gently, "but I'm not moving until we clarify with the gate agent or the supervisor. There's no indication in my reservation that I've been reassigned." The flight attendant's posture stiffened. "There's no need to call anyone else. I'm telling you what needs to happen. Please don't make this difficult." The passenger remained still. Her voice stayed soft, steady, and collected. "I'm not being difficult. I'm asking for confirmation." At that moment, another flight attendant approached, a middle-aged woman with a clipped bob haircut and an expression that tried, unsuccessfully, to appear neutral. She gave the first attendant a quick glance before turning to the passenger. "What's the issue here?" she asked. "She refuses to move," the first attendant said, her tone laced with irritation. We've told her she's been reassigned to economy, but she's arguing about her seat. The second attendant looked the passenger up and down in a way that wasn't overtly rude but carried the unmistakable implication of judgment, a silent, twisting evaluation of who she was, who she seemed to be, and who she apparently did not look like, someone who belonged in this section. The second attendant let out a small sigh. "Ma'am, business class seats are limited, and we need to prioritize certain passengers. You will have to take a seat in economy." The phrasing was different, but the message was the same. And it had shaped itself into something even less palatable. Prioritize certain passengers. The passenger felt something cold but familiar settle into her chest. She had traveled enough to recognize when she was being targeted, not for logistical reasons but for assumptions. Still, she refused to react with anger. Instead, she shifted her bag to her other shoulder and kept her face impassive. "Can you explain why I was chosen?" she asked. "I checked in early. My ticket is fully paid. I received no notice." The second attendant seemed irritated by the question. "Ma'am, that's irrelevant. The point is that these seats are reserved, and you're in the wrong one." "I'm not in the wrong seat," the passenger said, her voice still controlled. "This is my assigned seat." The first attendant stepped forward as if tired of the exchange. "If you don't move right now, we'll have to escalate this. We can call security." A few passengers gasped softly. The cabin's atmosphere, once calm, now buzzed with tension. People exchanged looks, some uneasy, some curious, some sympathetic. A young woman several rows back whispered something to her companion, who shook his head disapprovingly. Others glanced downward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction things were heading but unsure if they should get involved. The passenger felt all of their eyes but forced herself to stay composed. She reached into her bag slowly, deliberately. The attendant stiffened, clearly expecting something dramatic, only to watch her pull out a slim leather wallet. She held it in her hand, but her thumb covered the identification inside. She wasn't ready to reveal it, not yet. "I'm requesting you check with the gate agent," she said. "Or the supervising crew member. There has been no downgrade in my reservation." The first attendant scoffed, leaning slightly closer as if to make a point. "Ma'am, these seats aren't available to just anybody. We have elite passengers who have priority, business professionals, diplomats, high-ranking officials, people who actually need to be seated here. So please, stop arguing." The passenger almost laughed at the irony, almost. But she didn't give in to the impulse. She simply lifted her eyes and looked directly at the attendant, the corners of her mouth turning upward into a small, steady smile. "I understand," she said softly. "I truly do. But you may want to confirm your passenger list before making assumptions." This time, she let her thumb slide slightly, revealing just a sliver of the silver badge beneath the plastic. Not enough to identify it, just enough to catch the light. The attendants froze, confused but unsettled, as if they sensed they'd missed something important. But instead of clarifying, the passenger tucked the wallet back into her bag. She wanted to give them one more chance, one more opportunity to correct their behavior before this incident spiraled far beyond their control. The first attendant straightened and narrowed her eyes. "We're done discussing. Move to economy now or we'll remove you from the flight." The passenger stood still, her breathing calm and controlled, even as frustration stirred beneath her professionalism. "I'm not refusing to follow instructions," she said. "I'm asking for proper procedure." "That is proper procedure," the second attendant snapped. Silence stretched for a moment, thick, heavy, and uneasy. A male passenger cleared his throat as if wrestling with whether to intervene. An older woman shook her head disapprovingly at the crew. Another man whispering into his phone briefly lifted his eyes to observe the standoff. The air was no longer just tense, it was suffocating, charged with the unmistakable sense that something bigger was happening. The passenger slowly placed her bag on her seat, never breaking eye contact with the attendants. "Then please," she said quietly, "call whoever you need." That simple sentence seemed to shock them. It wasn't defiant or loud or defensive. It was confident, calm, certain. as if she knew exactly what the next steps would bring. The first attendant, seeming flustered, spun on her heel and marched toward the front galley, muttering to the other attendant. The second followed, looking over her shoulder with a mix of irritation and unease. Left alone for a moment, the passenger exhaled slowly, closing her eyes just long enough to recenter herself. She wasn't angry. She was disappointed, but sadly, not surprised. She had experienced worse in her career. In fact, she had handled situations far more serious than an airline crew's misguided assumptions. But there was something about this moment, the dismissive tone, the refusal to check facts, the presumption that she didn't belong in a premium seat, that pressed on something deeper. A memory, a pattern, a lifetime of dealing with people who decided before knowing her who she was supposed to be. She opened her eyes again, steady and composed, ready for whatever came next. A minute later, the flight attendant reappeared, this time accompanied by the captain. The tension in the cabin thickened the moment the second flight attendant arrived. She was slightly older than the first, with a tighter posture, a clipped stride, and an expression that suggested she believed she had far more authority than she actually did. She looked at the standing passenger the same way someone might look at an unexpected inconvenience, an expression that was half annoyance, half disbelief, as though simply seeing the woman in a business class seat had offended her sense of order. "I'm told there's a problem," the second attendant said, her tone sharp but coated with a thin veneer of practiced politeness. The first attendant gestured toward the black woman, her voice rising with impatience. "She refuses to move. I already explained the policy. She doesn't seem to think it applies to her." The second attendant nodded in a knowing, almost conspiratorial way, as though the two of them were silently agreeing on some unspoken narrative about the woman's motives. Then she turned fully toward the passenger, folding her hands in front of her in a posture meant to appear respectful, but the sneer behind her eyes made it anything but. "Ma'am, these seats are reserved for important passengers," she said, her tone dripping with an assumption that the woman, by default, could not be one of them. That sentence hung in the air like a sour note, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear clearly. A few heads turned. A man in a suit 2 rows back raised an eyebrow. A young woman across the aisle stopped scrolling her phone mid-gesture. Even the hum of the aircraft seemed quieter, as if the engines themselves were listening. The passenger felt a familiar sting beneath her calm exterior. It wasn't the first time someone had decided she didn't fit into the space she occupied. She had experienced versions of that comment in conference rooms, board meetings, hotels, and airports all over the country. Sometimes subtle, sometimes explicit, sometimes disguised as confusion, but the implication was always the same: you don't belong here. But she didn't react. She didn't let the irritation show in her face or posture. Instead, she offered the second attendant a calm, steady look. "I am an important passenger," she said simply, her voice even and controlled. "And I have a confirmed seat in business class." The second attendant let out a dry laugh, quiet but unmistakably mocking. "Ma'am, please," she said in the tone adults use to scold a stubborn child. "Let's not make this difficult." That word again, difficult. She had heard it many times, usually from people who weren't used to being questioned, people who believed their authority automatically trumped facts, procedure, and professionalism. It was a word used to label someone as a problem, a troublemaker, someone refusing to obey. Her gaze stayed steady. "I'm not making anything difficult," she replied softly. "I'm asking for a supervisor or the purser. That's standard protocol." But the attendants exchanged a quick glance, one full of impatience on one side and irritation on the other. "We are the ones handling it," the second attendant snapped. The first nodded aggressively. "We don't need to involve anyone else. We've already told you what needs to happen." The woman stayed composed. She had trained herself over many years not to react emotionally in situations like this. She took a slow breath, allowing the rising frustration to settle back into patience. "I would still like to speak to a supervisor," she said, enunciating each word clearly, refusing to let their tone push her into hostility. The first attendant scoffed loudly this time, making no effort to hide her disdain. "Why? So you can argue more. We don't have time for that. Just move to the seat we assigned you." That seat. The woman replied, "Is not mine. My ticket is for 4A. I confirmed it this morning. If it was changed, I should have been notified." "Ma'am," the second attendant cut in with a rehearsed sigh, "passengers are downgraded or reassigned all the time. You're not special." The word hit her like a spark, sharp, unnecessary, and telling. Several passengers shifted in their seats. A gray-haired man in row 3 looked over with a frown. Across the aisle, a young mother paused mid-conversation with her child. A few farther back angled their phones subtly, perhaps recording or preparing to. No one said anything out loud, but their expressions spoke clearly: confusion, discomfort, and in some cases, disbelief at the crew's tone. The woman's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in deepened awareness. The situation wasn't just unprofessional, it was escalating into something more dangerous for the crew than they seemed to realize. She spoke again, her tone warm but firm. "I'm not claiming to be special. I'm asking for you to follow procedure. If there was a change to my reservation, I have the right to verify." The first attendant's lips tightened. "You know what? This is ridiculous. We're wasting time. You need to move right now." "Or what?" the woman asked gently. The attendant didn't catch the subtle warning in her tone. "Or we'll call airport security," she snapped. A ripple of shock passed through the cabin. Someone let out a soft, "Oh wow." Another whispered, "She didn't even do anything." A few passengers exchanged looks that said plainly that the situation didn't warrant such a threat. The woman stayed perfectly still. "You want to call security," she said quietly, "because I asked for clarification. Because you're refusing to follow instructions," the first attendant shot back. "No," the woman corrected with calm precision. "I am refusing to abandon a seat I paid for without explanation." The second attendant folded her arms. "We don't have to explain anything," she declared defensively. "Oh, but you do," the woman replied softly. "You absolutely do." There was something in the calmness of her voice, some faint hint of unshakable confidence, that made a few nearby passengers straighten in their seats. The attendants noticed it too. They exchanged another uneasy glance. The woman placed her carry-on gently in the aisle beside her leg and folded her hands in front of her. She wasn't being aggressive. She wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't even moving. She simply stood with a quiet authority that neither attendant could quite comprehend. "I'd still like to speak to a supervisor," she repeated, her tone as steady as a still lake. The first attendant let out a frustrated groan. "This is unbelievable." "Fine. You want a supervisor. Here." She gestured at the second attendant dramatically. "She's the supervisor on this flight." The second attendant lifted her chin proudly, as though expecting the declaration to settle the dispute instantly, like a gavel hitting a courtroom podium. The woman looked at her for a long moment, her gaze giving nothing away. Then she spoke in a voice so soft yet so certain that the two attendants involuntarily leaned forward to hear it. "No," she said. "I want to speak to the person who outranks both of you." Both attendants stiffened, offended at the implication that their authority wasn't enough. "Outranks us," the second attendant repeated, her voice laced with irritation. "Ma'am, we are the crew assigned to this cabin. There is no one else." The woman gave a slow, unhurried blink. "So there's no purser, no lead flight attendant, no one assigned to oversee service and passenger handling." They paused. The discomfort on their faces was unmistakable. They hadn't expected her to understand airline hierarchy, let alone call it out accurately. Before either could form a response, a voice rose from one row back. "There's always a lead flight attendant on board," the man in the suit said quietly. He didn't sound confrontational, just factual. Another passenger nodded. "Yeah, she has the right to ask." The attendants shot them sharp looks, as if warning them not to interfere. The woman kept her eyes on the crew. "Please call the lead," she said again, her voice still soft but carrying a weight they could not ignore. The first attendant opened her mouth to argue, but the second placed a hand on her arm, signaling her to stop. Something about the woman's unwavering tone, the watching passengers, and the growing tension forced them to reassess the situation. The second attendant straightened her uniform. "Fine," she muttered reluctantly. "But I'm telling you now, it won't change anything." She turned sharply and walked toward the galley, heels clacking against the floor with stiff, irritated precision. The first attendant stayed behind, arms crossed tightly, glaring at the woman with a mixture of frustration and, underneath it all, a growing nervousness. The woman didn't react. She simply stood with the same calm composure she had maintained from the moment they stopped her. Her breathing was even, her expression unreadable. She didn't fidget, didn't shift her weight, didn't show a flicker of doubt. And that stillness, more than anything, made the first attendant increasingly uneasy. Around them, the business-class cabin had fallen almost entirely silent. No one was sipping water, adjusting blankets, or starting movies anymore. Every passenger within earshot was now watching the scene unfold with a mixture of disbelief and quiet anticipation. The woman could feel their attention, but she didn't let it influence her. She had been in the spotlight before, under far more serious circumstances than this. This was nothing. Annoying, disrespectful, unacceptable, but nothing she wasn't equipped to handle. She let her gaze drift briefly toward the window beside her seat. The runway outside was bathed in bright daylight, the sky a soft gradient of blue. She focused on that for a brief moment, grounding herself. She reminded herself of who she was, what she represented, what authority she carried, and how many times she had been forced to navigate rooms full of people who underestimated her. It wasn't ego. It was reality. And she had no intention of surrendering her dignity to satisfy someone else's assumptions. A moment later, the second attendant returned, but not alone. Behind her walked a tall man in a crisp uniform, his presence instantly commanding in a way neither attendant could mimic. His shoulders were squared, his expression concerned but controlled, and the captain's wings pinned to his chest gleamed under the cabin lights. The first attendant's posture shifted instantly, straightening as if she were suddenly afraid he might reprimand her. The woman looked at him calmly, already knowing what would happen next. The tension in the cabin had settled into a thick, almost suffocating weight by the time the first attendant leaned in and delivered her threat. Her voice wasn't loud, but the sharpness carried through the air like a blade. "If you don't move right now," she said through clenched teeth, "we'll call airport security and have you removed from the flight. Do you understand?" The surrounding passengers stiffened. A man in the second row straightened up, his brows knitting together in disapproval. A teenager across the aisle paused the music in her earbuds. Someone farther back murmured softly, "Why are they talking to her like that?" The mood had shifted completely, no longer just curiosity, it was discomfort, disbelief, and something deeper. Something that made even the hum of the air vents seem louder, as though the plane itself knew something was wrong. The woman stood perfectly still, her expression undisturbed. She inhaled slowly, letting the breath push down the emotion rising inside her. It wasn't fear. She had never reacted to threats with fear. It was more of a quiet, resigned disappointment that people who were meant to ensure safety and service had already chosen hostility instead. She had faced conflict from far more intimidating institutions than a pair of overconfident flight attendants. She had seen behavior worse than this in places where people held far more power. But still, something about the arrogance in their voices struck a chord that vibrated down her spine. She lowered her gaze briefly to her bag resting beside her leg. The leather handle was warm under her fingers as she unzipped the front pocket with a slow, deliberate motion. The attendants watched her hands with suspicion, their shoulders tensing as though expecting something dramatic, when all she did was reach inside and pull out a slim, dark wallet. It wasn't anything flashy or attention-grabbing, just a simple case with a discreet silver emblem embedded in the corner. She held it lightly between her fingers, her thumb resting over the clear plastic window. Beneath her thumb was the badge, gleaming faintly under the cabin lights. The gold edges caught a sliver of light, casting a tiny reflection onto the aisle carpet. But she didn't lift her thumb. She didn't reveal the text. She didn't let them see the authority it represented. Not yet. Instead, she looked at the attendants with a composed, almost gentle expression. "Before you call security," she said quietly, "you may want to consider that I know exactly how airport protocols work. And I am fully prepared to follow them." The first attendant scoffed. Actually scoffed, like a teenager dismissing a teacher. "Oh please," she said with a roll of her eyes, "don't pretend you know how this works. We deal with difficult passengers all the time. The second attendant nodded firmly, her jaw tightening. If you had simply done as we asked, she added sharply, this wouldn't be turning into such a scene. It wasn't the words that stung, it was the assumption behind them. The assumption that this woman, this particular woman, must be causing trouble simply because she dared to question their authority. Because she didn't shrink. Because she didn't apologize. Because she didn't accept mistreatment quietly. Other passengers exchanged uneasy glances. A few shook their heads subtly. A man with reading glasses rubbed his temples. A woman lifting her infant bounced the child gently to soothe them, though the real discomfort wasn't the child's, it was hers. The woman didn't lift the badge. She didn't reveal the title. She didn't show them the weight of the federal seal imprinted into the laminated surface. She simply held the wallet in one hand, thumb still covering everything but the faint shimmer of metal. The first attendant scoffed again. What is that even supposed to be? She asked, gesturing dismissively at the wallet. Your gym membership. A fake ID. Please don't waste our time. A soft gasp rippled from somewhere behind them. Even passengers who didn't know what the badge was could sense the disrespect dripping from the attendant's tone like spilled oil. The woman kept her face calm. A slight smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, barely noticeable, but enough that the first attendant paused, suddenly unsure if she had miscalculated. You think I'm bluffing, the woman said softly. The attendants didn't hesitate. We know you are, the first one snapped. Absolutely, the second added, folding her arms with cocky certainty. Passengers try this all the time. Oh, I'm important. Oh, I have connections. Oh, I'll report you. We've heard it all before. The woman tilted her head slightly, studying them, not with anger, but with a certain curiosity, as though trying to understand them. Their arrogance, their certainty, their complete refusal to consider they might be making a serious mistake. The first attendant smirked. Honestly, you're not even the first person today to pretend they have some kind of authority. The second leaned in, lowering her voice as if sharing a joke. Let me guess, you're some big executive. Or a frequent flyer elite. She added a sarcastic flourish to the last words, as if mocking the idea. The woman let out a slow breath. Not a sigh. Not a sign of frustration. More like a deliberate release of tension, a quiet preparation for what would come next. Passengers shifted. Some sat straighter. Some leaned forward. A few exchanged glances that said, very clearly, these attendants are about to regret that. But the woman didn't show the badge. Not yet. Because she wanted to see it, the moment when realization would hit them like a wave. The moment when their certainty would collapse under the weight of the truth. The moment they would understand that they hadn't merely mishandled a seating issue, they had insulted someone who knew aviation law better than anyone on this plane, someone with the authority to conduct investigations, issue violations, and oversee compliance protocols that affected every airline in the country. And she wanted to see how far they would take this before the truth forced itself into the open. She kept her voice soft, almost gentle. If you call security, she said, I will cooperate. And when they arrive, this, she tapped her covered badge lightly with her thumb, will be the first thing they see. Just so you're prepared. The attendants shared another eye roll, synchronized in their arrogance. To them, it looked like a desperate attempt to bluff her way out of trouble. To them, it was laughable. To them, she was simply another passenger trying to intimidate them because she didn't get what she wanted. The first attendant snorted. Ma'am, we don't have time for your games. The second waved a hand dismissively. If that's supposed to scare us, it's not working. The woman's eyes softened. There was something almost sad in her expression now, not sadness for herself, but for them. For how blind they were to the consequences they were creating in real time. I understand, she said quietly. You don't believe me. Because there's nothing to believe, the first attendant snapped. And you're wasting our time, the second added. The woman lifted the wallet slightly, not enough to reveal anything but enough to let the badge glimmer again. She watched their faces carefully. Nothing, not even a flicker of suspicion. She nodded slowly. All right. She slipped the wallet back into her bag, almost tenderly, as if tucking away a truth the attendants didn't deserve to see yet. "The first," attendant huffed. "Good. Now move to the seat we told you." The woman shook her head gently, a movement so small it almost wasn't noticeable. "No," she said calmly. "I'll wait." "For who?" the second asked, her voice rising in disbelief. "For whoever you call next," the woman answered. The attendants blinked, exchanging another irritated, incredulous look. They clearly expected her to crumble, to give in, to obey. Instead, her refusal was steady, grounded, impossibly composed. "Unbelievable," the first attendant muttered. "You're about to get yourself kicked off this flight," the second warned. The woman smiled. "If that happens, then that happens." The first attendant spun around. "Fine. We're calling security. You asked for it." Passengers shifted uneasily. A few murmured in protest. Someone whispered, "This is too much," while another sighed, "They're going to regret this." As the attendants marched toward the front of the cabin, backs stiff with indignation, the woman remained exactly where she was, silent, poised, completely unshaken. She knew what was coming. She knew what her badge meant. She knew what federal authority she carried behind her calm smile. And she knew that the moment the next person stepped into the aisle, whether it was the lead attendant, the captain, or airport security themselves, the truth would unravel fast. The attendants had no idea the storm they were walking into. They thought she was bluffing. They thought she was powerless. They thought she was just another passenger they could push around. And she was letting them think exactly that. Because the fall from certainty to fear is always the most dramatic when someone climbs the ladder of arrogance themselves. The woman stood quietly, folding her hands in front of her, waiting for the moment their entire world would shift. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath. The passengers sat frozen in a strange mixture of anticipation and dread, watching the two attendants march down the aisle with quick, irritated steps. The woman stayed exactly where she was, her posture steady, her breathing calm, her expression unreadable. She had returned the wallet to her bag, but this time she didn't keep the badge fully hidden. A sliver of it was showing, just enough for anyone walking directly toward her to see exactly what she carried. Not a threat, not a declaration, just the truth, placed gently where it belonged. The attendants disappeared behind the galley curtain, their voices muffled but sharp. Everyone could hear the tense whispers. Everyone could feel the pressure rising like a kettle about to whistle. A man in the third row leaned forward and whispered to his wife, "This feels like it's about to get serious." She nodded, not taking her eyes off the aisle. For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched, a tight rope pulled thinner and thinner. Then the curtain shifted, not with the hurried rustle of a flight attendant, but with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who carried authority simply by being present. A tall figure emerged. The captain. His uniform was immaculate, his white shirt crisp and perfectly pressed. The gold stripes on his shoulders gleamed under the cabin lights. His pilot wings shimmered against his chest, a symbol of responsibility far greater than anything the attendants had demonstrated. He walked with a kind of measured confidence, a quiet command that came not from arrogance but from years of handling moments where calm leadership mattered more than anything else. But today, that calm had already been fractured. He stepped fully into the aisle, adjusting his hat slightly as he looked ahead. The attendants stood behind him, shrinking by the second, their frowns dissolving into uncertain half-smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They clearly expected the captain to reprimand the woman, to restore their sense of superiority, to confirm their assumptions, to validate their interpretation of the problem. The captain took 3 more steps. Then his eyes landed on her. On the woman standing in the aisle with a composed stillness that radiated a very different kind of authority. On the bag beside her. On the wallet partially visible at the top, the edge of a badge peeking out with unmistakable gold lines. His stride faltered. Only for a millisecond, a tiny interruption in his otherwise perfect rhythm, but it was noticeable. His eyes widened, not dramatically, not theatrically, but with a sharp, focused recognition reserved for people who suddenly see something they never expected to see. He stepped closer. The woman didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply placed her fingertips on the wallet and slid it an inch higher, revealing the badge in full. The cabin lights caught it perfectly. The gold seal. The bold lettering. The federal insignia. Federal Aviation Administration. Safety Director. Every word gleamed. Every letter spoke louder than any argument she could have made. The captain's face drained of color. His lips parted, but no sound came out. For a moment, he wasn't a commercial airline captain. He was a man who had just realized he was standing in front of one of the highest-ranking officials in the aviation industry. A woman who oversaw flight safety standards. A woman who reviewed compliance reports. A woman who had the authority to evaluate, investigate, and, if necessary, sanction airlines. A woman who could sit in any business class seat in the country, because she was one of the people who defined what safety and service were supposed to look like. The attendants behind him visibly stiffened. Their eyes darted. From the badge to the captain to the woman, confusion melting into fear one frame at a time. The captain swallowed. His voice, usually firm and commanding, was softer, almost reverent, when he finally spoke. "Ma'am, I didn't realize." The woman lifted her gaze and met his eyes. Her expression wasn't gloating, not triumphant, not smug. It was calm, controlled, gentle even. She didn't need to revel in his shock. She didn't need to assert anything. The badge spoke for her. "I asked to speak with someone who outranks the cabin crew," she said softly. "Thank you for coming." Her tone was simple, steady, polite, yet impossibly composed. A few passengers shifted, feeling the shift in the air like a change in pressure before a storm. The captain took a deep breath. May I see the badge fully?" She held it out without a word. He extended his hand slowly, as though touching it might break something fragile. He lifted the wallet gently, tilting it enough to read every line clearly. His eyes scanned the embossed lettering once, twice, 3 times, his brain catching up with reality. Then he snapped upright. His whole posture changed instantly. His shoulders pulled back. His jaw tightened. His expression transformed into a blend of dread and respect. He handed the badge back with both hands. Both. That alone made the attendants pale. No one handed anything back with both hands unless the item, and the person, commanded unquestionable respect. The captain stepped aside slightly, turning halfway toward his crew. "Is this the passenger you were addressing?" The attendants froze. The first one opened her mouth but no sound emerged. The second forced a smile that collapsed almost immediately. We were just trying to, solve the seating issue," she stammered. The captain's eyes darkened. By threatening her with security. By refusing to verify her ticket. By refusing her request for a supervisor. By ignoring protocol. His tone wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The quiet, tightly controlled disappointment in his voice was far worse than anger. Passengers exchanged looks of satisfaction, not because they enjoyed watching the attendants squirm, but because justice had arrived. The truth had surfaced. The power imbalance had flipped. The first attendant tried again. "Sir, we didn't know who she was." The captain turned sharply. "You don't need to know who she is to treat her with respect." Silence followed his words. Heavy. Unavoidable. The woman spoke before anyone else could. "Captain," she said softly, "I'm not here to create a scene. I simply asked for the seat I paid for." Her voice didn't waver. It didn't falter. It held the quiet dignity of someone who had spent a career in environments where composure mattered more than ego. The captain nodded quickly. "And you will absolutely receive it," he said with a firmness that brooked no argument. He gestured to the seat, her seat, without hesitation. "Please, allow me." He stepped aside, extending his arm in a guiding gesture that was almost ceremonial. The woman nodded once, gracefully, and took her seat, finally. She placed her bag beside her and settled into the chair as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But the significance wasn't lost on anyone watching. The attendants, faces burned with the realization that they had nearly thrown a top federal official out of her rightful seat. They had nearly insulted someone whose authority towered over airlines, airports, and aviation regulations. The captain crouched slightly beside her, lowering his voice. "Ma'am, I assure you I will be handling this immediately." He glanced at the attendants, who stood trembling behind him. "This was unacceptable. I apologize deeply on behalf of the crew and the airline." She looked at him with a calm expression that held neither bitterness nor anger. "I understand, Captain. Tensions happen. Mistakes happen. What matters is how they're corrected. Relief flickered in his eyes, but only briefly. Because he knew, correction wouldn't be simple. Not for the crew who stood behind him like statues, staring at the floor because looking at the passengers was impossible now. The captain stood again, his posture returning to full command. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said to the cabin with a steady voice, "thank you for your patience. We will be departing shortly." The entire business class section watched with a strange combination of awe and disbelief as he stepped away from her, as though he were leaving the presence of someone far above his rank. He paused halfway down the aisle. Then he turned to the attendants. "You too," he said quietly, yet commanding enough that everyone heard, "Galley." Now. They followed him stiffly, their faces pale with a new kind of fear rooted not in punishment but in realization. Realization of who they had spoken to. Realization of how badly they had mishandled the situation. Realization that the consequences were no longer hypothetical. And as the curtain closed behind them, the woman sat back in her seat, exhaling slowly. Not triumphantly. Not victoriously. Just with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose patience had finally revealed the truth. Passengers around her offered subtle nods, small smiles, gentle acknowledgments of support. One whispered, "Good for you." Another said softly, "They had no idea." But she simply gave a polite smile in return, folding her hands in her lap, her badge tucked safely away once more. The storm had not been loud. It had been quiet, controlled, and devastatingly precise. The captain's apology came so quickly and so sharply that everyone around seemed to feel the shift in the air. One moment the tension had been thick and almost suffocating, the kind of pressure that made passengers hold their breath. The next moment, everything snapped into a different reality. The crew members, who just seconds earlier were acting with misplaced authority and condescending confidence, suddenly looked like statues. Their faces froze in a mixture of disbelief, fear, and dawning realization, as if someone had pulled the floor out from beneath their assumptions. The captain stepped closer to the woman with a level of respect so sudden and so complete that it contrasted violently with the crew's behavior up until now. His posture was straight, and his voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly how serious this situation had become. He knew instantly that the woman standing before him wasn't just a passenger, not just a traveler with a complaint, and definitely not someone they could bully, downgrade, or dismiss. She was a top official, the Federal Aviation Administration's safety director. A person with the authority to oversee investigations, approve certifications, demand compliance, and enforce regulations that shaped the entire airline industry. The captain understood the gravity the moment his eyes found the badge. He apologized again, slower this time, his voice steadier but filled with genuine regret. Passengers watched with widening eyes, many of them realizing for the first time the true magnitude of the incident happening right in front of them. Some exchanged looks, whispering in disbelief. A few shook their heads, thinking back on what they had witnessed. The rude tone, the dismissive attitude, the attempt to pressure her into giving up the seat she had rightfully paid for, and the casual way the attendants had assumed she didn't belong in that part of the aircraft. Everything suddenly made sense, and everything suddenly looked 10 times worse. The woman listened calmly, her expression unreadable, but her silence held power. It wasn't the silence of someone intimidated. It was the silence of someone who had seen this kind of behavior too many times and had long since learned how to navigate it with experience and restraint. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten anything. She didn't need to. The revelation of her title alone had already set the entire plane into a quiet storm of panic, especially among the crew. The lead flight attendant, who had been the most aggressive in trying to downgrade her, looked like her legs might give out. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words emerged. Her eyes flicked rapidly between the captain and the passenger, as if searching for some explanation that would make this situation less disastrous. But there was none. She knew exactly what she had done. She had violated protocol, policy, and basic professionalism. Worse than that, she had discriminated, made assumptions, and treated a high-ranking official with disrespect in front of an entire cabin of witnesses. Behind her, the second attendant stood rigid, her hands clasped so tightly they had turned pale. She swallowed, her breath shaky, clearly aware that this incident was no longer something that could be brushed aside with excuses. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a minor customer complaint. This was the kind of event that triggered mandatory reports, internal investigations, disciplinary reviews, and possibly federal involvement. The consequences of mishandling a passenger, any passenger, were already severe. But mishandling someone who literally oversaw aviation safety at the national level, that was career-ending territory. The captain, still facing the woman, explained in a low voice that there had been no authorization for a downgrade and that she absolutely had the right to her assigned seat. He assured her that she would be treated with absolute respect and that the situation would be handled appropriately. Every word was measured, careful, and respectful, as if he knew he needed to tread with precision to prevent the situation from worsening for his crew. But the woman didn't ask for special treatment. She simply nodded, acknowledging his apology but showing no desire to escalate the moment any further, not yet, anyway. She understood the power dynamics, understood the shock radiating through the cabin, and understood that sometimes the most powerful response was composure. Her calmness only increased the anxiety in the crew, because they didn't know what she was thinking or planning. They only knew that whatever happened next was entirely out of their control. The captain stepped aside and gestured to her seat, politely inviting her to sit. The attendants parted instantly, their stiff postures showing just how terrified they were. As she settled into her seat with grace and quiet poise, the weight of what had happened pressed heavily on everyone in the cabin. The passengers continued to stare, stunned silent. A few of them shook their heads at the attendants, some with disappointment, others with disapproval. Some whispered things like, "They really messed up," or, "That's going to be a nightmare for them." The crew avoided eye contact with everyone. The lead attendant's hands trembled as she adjusted the cabin controls. Every movement she made seemed slow and cautious, as if she were afraid of drawing any more attention to herself. She kept glancing at the cockpit door, as though hoping the captain would give her reassurance, but he offered none. His expression was stern, focused, and visibly frustrated. He knew that this incident would be reported the moment they landed. There was no hiding it. Too many people had witnessed it, and the passenger involved held too much authority to ignore. The second attendant whispered something under her breath, a quiet apology that never reached the woman's ears. But even if it had, it wouldn't have changed anything. The damage was already done. Their decisions, their tone, their assumptions, every piece of it was now part of a chain of consequences that would unfold long after the flight was over. The captain returned to the cockpit, but not before giving the attendants a look that made their stomachs sink. It was the look of someone silently saying, "Prepare for what's coming." His door closed behind him with a finality that felt like the closing of a courtroom, leaving the two attendants standing alone in the aisle, overwhelmed by the weight of their actions. The rest of the cabin slowly settled, though the atmosphere remained tense. Passengers kept glancing toward the woman, not out of pity, but out of admiration. Her composure had been remarkable. She had stood firm, never raised her voice, never resorted to anger, and yet she had dismantled the arrogance of the crew without needing to do anything except reveal the truth of her identity. It was a reminder that power didn't always need to be loud. Sometimes it came from the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who they were and what they represented. As the attendants resumed their duties, every move they made was cautious, respectful, and overly deliberate. They were painfully aware that one misstep could make things even worse. They spoke to passengers in overly polite voices, avoided taking any action without double-checking instructions, and constantly glanced at the woman in business class, as though expecting her to suddenly call them out again. She didn't. She simply sat there, calmly reading through documents on her tablet, entirely unbothered by the storm she had just walked through. But even in her silence, the consequences were already forming. The captain knew that this flight would require a detailed incident report. The airline's corporate office would be notified. The FAA would review the behavior of the crew, not because she demanded it, but because protocol required it. And the moment her title appeared in the system logs next to a complaint or an incident, the weight of the investigation would shift from routine to urgent. Word spread quietly among the passengers too. By the time the flight reached cruising altitude, nearly everyone knew that the crew had tried to downgrade a woman who quite literally oversaw their entire industry's safety standards. Some passengers looked horrified on behalf of the airline. Others looked mortified for the attendants. Some simply stared in disbelief, replaying the scene in their minds and shaking their heads as if they still couldn't believe what they had witnessed. The woman, meanwhile, remained calm, almost serene, as she continued reading. She wasn't thinking about revenge or retribution. She didn't need to. The truth had already spoken for itself. Her badge had carried more authority than any argument she could have made, and showing it had been enough to expose everything wrong about the way she had been treated. Inside the galley, the two attendants whispered anxiously, their voices shaking slightly. They talked about what to do, what to say, how to explain themselves. But no explanation would be enough. They knew they had crossed a line they could never uncross. Their actions had been witnessed by dozens of passengers, people who could, at any moment, record statements, submit complaints, or post videos online. Their careers, reputations, and futures in the airline industry now hung on the fragile thread of the upcoming investigation. Nothing could change what had already happened. Nothing could undo the moment they assumed she wasn't important enough for a business class seat. Nothing could erase the tone they used, the disrespect they showed, or the way they dismissed her as if her concerns didn't matter. Every decision had been made on assumptions, and every assumption had been wrong. And the worst part, the part that echoed in their minds like a warning they had ignored, was that she hadn't needed to threaten them. She hadn't needed to raise her voice. She hadn't even needed to say her title. All she had done was reveal her badge, and everything crumbled. Their fear wasn't just about getting in trouble. It was about realizing how easily they had shown their true attitudes in a moment where professionalism should have guided them. And now every passenger on that plane knew it. As the aircraft continued its journey through calm skies, the woman remained quiet, composed, and dignified. And the crew, frozen in dread, understood that their behavior might very soon become the subject of the kind of investigation that changed policies, training programs, and careers, not because she demanded justice but because justice was already built into the system she helped lead. The woman quietly takes her rightful seat in business class while the crew scrambles in panic. By the end of the flight, a formal report is already being prepared. The attendants learn the hard way. Never judge a passenger, you never know who they are. She sat down with the kind of calm that only comes from experience, from having dealt with situations far more intense than a disrespectful airline crew. Her movements were quiet, deliberate, unbothered, as though she had already placed the entire incident behind her. But the crew could not do the same. Their minds were spinning, their nerves frayed, their hands trembling as they tried to force themselves back into the routine of cabin service. Their panic was not loud, but it was intense, the kind that left a tightness in the chest and a sinking feeling in the stomach. Every second felt like another reminder of what they had done. Passengers around her watched silently, some in awe, others in disbelief. The business class cabin, which had moments ago been filled with tension and confrontations, now settled into a thick, uneasy quiet. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of comfort, but the heavy quiet of realization. People glanced from the woman to the attendants, understanding now the gravity of the situation and the immense authority she carried without ever needing to show it until pushed to the limit. Her presence alone seemed to shift the entire energy of the cabin. She didn't posture. She didn't glare. She didn't retaliate. She simply existed with dignity, and that alone was powerful enough to expose everything that had gone wrong. The attendants whispered frantically to one another near the galley, their voices shaky and low. One kept wringing her hands, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her uniform as she tried to make sense of how things had escalated so quickly. The other kept glancing toward the cockpit, as if hoping the captain might reassure them, tell them the situation wasn't as serious as it felt. But there was no reassurance coming. The captain understood exactly what an incident like this meant, and so did they. It wasn't something they could bury or brush aside. Not when the passenger involved had authority at the highest levels of aviation oversight. The woman, meanwhile, opened her tablet and resumed reading, unfazed. She didn't act victorious or smug. She didn't seem interested in watching the crew crumble under their own fear. She simply carried on with her work, reflecting the professionalism they should have shown from the beginning. Her composure was a reminder that power didn't need to be loud or aggressive. Sometimes it was quiet, subtle, and grounded in the knowledge that the truth spoke for itself. Throughout the flight, passengers exchanged whispers. Some described the arrogance they had seen. Others replayed the moment the captain recognized her badge, the shock on his face, and the instant shift in tone that followed. A few passengers shook their heads in disapproval at the crew's behavior, now that they understood who had been mistreated. But even those who didn't know her title could recognize fairness when they saw it. She had never asked for special treatment. She had simply asked for what she paid for. It was the crew who had created the problem by assuming she didn't belong. The attendants walked the aisle with forced politeness, speaking softly, choosing their words with desperate care. Their smiles were tight, fragile, and clearly strained. The kind of smiles worn by people who realized the consequences of their actions were no longer hypothetical, they were inevitable. They avoided looking directly at the woman unless absolutely necessary, and even then, their eyes flickered away quickly, as if contact alone might deepen their guilt. Inside the cockpit, the captain typed his incident notes with a heavy expression. He wasn't angry at her, he was angry at his crew. Angry that they had put the airline in such a dangerous position. Angry that they had allowed personal biases to override professionalism. Angry that they had nearly sparked a federal-level issue on what should have been a routine flight. He knew this report would reach corporate. He knew it would reach the FAA. And he knew the woman sitting calmly in business class wouldn't need to say a single word for the investigation to take shape. As the flight continued, the mood aboard the aircraft slowly shifted into something resembling resignation. The attendants tried to carry out their duties, but everything they did felt shadowed by the knowledge of what awaited them after landing. They replayed their own words, their own tones, their own choices, wishing desperately they had handled things differently. But the past could not be undone. Every moment had been witnessed by passengers. Every action had been noticed. Every disrespectful gesture was now part of a story that someone with immense authority had been forced to endure. The woman remained calm, letting the flight unfold naturally. She didn't need to escalate anything. She didn't need to demand accountability. She understood better than anyone that systems were in place for a reason. And she trusted that the system would respond appropriately, not because of her title, but because of the truth. She had lived long enough to know that sometimes justice didn't need anger. It simply needed exposure. When the plane began its descent, the anxiety among the attendants only intensified. They exchanged tense glances, silently wondering what would happen once they landed. Would they be called aside immediately? Would they have to file written statements? Would they be suspended pending review? All of it was possible. All of it was likely. And the dread of that uncertainty clung to them like a weight they could not shake off. The woman gathered her things as the aircraft touched down, her movements calm and unhurried. She didn't rush. She didn't linger. She simply prepared to disembark like any other traveler, though everyone knew she was not just any traveler. She stood up with quiet confidence, offering no dramatic reaction, no lingering look, no confrontation. Her silence was not forgiveness, it was simply the final reminder of her strength. She had never needed to retaliate. She had never needed to explain who she was. The truth had done all the work. By the time the wheels hit the runway, the captain had already finalized his report. The airline's internal system had flagged the incident. Notifications had been sent. The chain of accountability was already moving, methodically and inevitably. The attendants knew their fate was now out of their hands. Their behavior, their assumptions, and their decisions had spoken louder than any excuse they could attempt to give. As the passengers stood to retrieve their belongings, several glanced at the woman with respect. Some nodded subtly. Others simply observed her with newfound understanding. She remained composed, moving with grace, unaffected by the chaos her presence had unintentionally revealed. And the attendants, pale and trembling, finally understood a truth they would never forget. Never judge a passenger, because you never know who they are, what authority they hold, or how deeply your actions might echo. Their fear wasn't just about consequences. It was about realizing how easily they had exposed their true behavior, and how quickly that behavior had unraveled their confidence. And as the woman stepped off the plane, leaving them to face the repercussions, that lesson settled in permanently. Never judge a passenger. You never know who you're talking to. And sometimes, the quietest person on the plane holds the loudest power of all.